morning. Good morning. I'm Helene Weinstein, Chair of the New York State Assembly's Ways and Means Committee, co-chair of today's hearing. Today we begin the 9th in a series of hearings conducted by the Joint Fiscal Committees of the Legislature regarding the governor's proposed budget for fiscal year 2020-2021. The hearings are conducted pursuant to the New York State Constitution and the legislative law. Today, the Assembly Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee will hear testimony concerning the governor's budget proposal for local governments. I'll now introduce members of the Assembly, and then Senator Krueger, Chair of Senate Finance, will introduce members of her conference. So we have to my left, Assemblyman Thiel, Chair of our Local Governments Committee, and Assemblyman Braunstein, Chair of our Cities Committee. We have Assemblyman Fall and Assemblyman Ortiz. Senator Krueger.
Good morning, everyone. I'm joined by Senator John Liu, Senator Brian Benjamin, Senator Zelnor Myrie, Senator Gustavo Rivera, and my ranker on finance, Jim Seward, will introduce his members.
Thank you. We're pleased to be joined this morning from my conference, the ranking member of the Local Governments Committee, Senator Patty Ritchie, as well as a former county executive, now state senator, George Borrello.
And I made a major mistake and did not introduce the chair, James Gorin. Sorry about that, Senator Gorin.
Assemblyman Ra will introduce, our ranker on Ways and Means will introduce the members of his conference.
Oh, and Senator John Brooks is also slid over there, so I missed him too. Thank you.
Good morning. We're joined this morning by Assemblyman Colin Schmidt, the ranking member on the Local Governments Committee, and Assemblywoman Nicole Malliotakis, member of the Ways and Means Committee.
So before introducing our first witness, just want to remind all the witnesses testifying today, if you could please keep your statement within the allotted time limit so everyone can be afforded the opportunity to speak. For the witnesses that will be coming later, your testimony has already been submitted, circulated to the members, so there's no need to read it verbatim. You'll never get to the end. It always takes longer than you think. And so a concise summary of your major points would be much more productive. And really for the members, and the witnesses, we do have the time clocks. Please pay attention. The clocks are for both questions and answers so that we can get to the last person on the list and have them have an opportunity to also speak, as well as have all our questions answered. Just another bit of rules. For members, the chair of the committee has 10 minutes, of the relevant committee has 10 minutes, all other members 5 minutes, and the chairs are the only ones who have a second round. Senator.
We've also been joined by Senator Robert Jackson and Senator Anna Kaplan.
So with all that being said, we are ready to begin. Our first witness, no stranger to the table. We'll see if we could keep it within a reasonable time. Mayor Bill de Blasio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Weinstein, Chair Krueger. Thank you so much, Ranking Minority Members Seward and Ra. Thank you. And of course, thanks to all the members here and your leaders, Majority Leader Stuart Cousins and Speaker Hastie. I want to thank everyone for the work we've all done together and the extraordinary work you did in the last legislative session. I'm joined here today by two key members of my team, our City Budget Director, Melanie Hartzog, and our Interim Director of State Legislative Affairs, Shatad Floyd, who will join me in answering your questions. Right up front, I want to say, given the shootings that targeted our police force this weekend, I know you will all join me in keeping our officers in your thoughts and prayers. 3 brave police officers, thank God they all will make a full recovery according to the doctors, but I ask that everyone please keep them and their families their precinct, the entire NYPD, in your thoughts and prayers. This is the 7th time, chairs, that I've had the honor of being here before you. Again, thank you for what you achieved in 2019, extraordinary impact for the whole state and for New York City. My written comments speak to the appreciation we all feel for what you achieved in 2019. Unfortunately, I have to turn now to a more painful situation in this budget, which is the fact that there are extraordinary cuts proposed in the executive budget, which would have a truly negative effect on the people of our city. And I will delineate a few of those points right now, but I need to first say that the cuts in this year's executive budget are of a magnitude we have never seen before. Right now, the combined cuts would have an impact of $1.4 billion in reduced services for the people of New York City. $1.4 billion. It is fair to say that we cannot let that happen. We're depending on all of you for help and support in this moment. These cuts would be nothing less than devastating for everyday New Yorkers. We are used to, in past executive budgets, attempts to cut. And in fact, if you add up over the previous 6 years the impact of cuts to New York City by the previous executive budgets and the ones that were ultimately enacted, it is more than $1 billion in cuts and cost shifts. So I want you to consider this point. The fiscal 21 proposed cuts in the executive budget total more than all the cuts New York City has sustained in all 6 years combined previously. That is the magnitude. We need your help more than ever before. I'll go through the 3 key areas that make up this $1.4 billion cut. First and biggest, the governor wants to shift $1.1 billion in Medicaid costs to New York City. It's not only unfair, it's just not grounded in the reality of how Medicaid works. I want to remind you, we have already sustained a 1% cut in Medicaid funding to our health and hospitals. That was announced in December. The Medicaid redesign team is potentially looking at up to $2.5 billion in additional savings. And if it cannot find those savings, the governor proposes to take that $2.5 billion and cut it from localities around the state. To say the least, we are all in the same boat here. Alone, any of these cuts would have painful consequences, but adding them together would put the health and welfare of the state's largest city at risk and would undermine all the progress we've made in recent years, bringing the Health and Hospitals Corporation back to solvency and making it more effective. This would literally set us back years. It's the largest public health system in the nation, caring for more than 1 million New York City residents each year. It could not withstand cuts of this magnitude without reductions, profound reductions in services to people who need health care. And again, this would be true all over the state of New York. What would it mean for us if there was a $1.1 billion cut? First, in health and hospitals, we project it would mean the closing of 19 neighborhood clinics, which treat 140,000 patients a year. It would result in the layoff of 1,300 doctors and nurses, frontline healthcare providers, which would result in longer wait times for patients. And the specialty areas that would be affected would be treatment of cancer, heart disease, mental health, a number of other very, very serious needs. This could potentially lead to the total elimination of the Summer Youth Employment Program, which reaches 70,000 young people each summer. It could lead to the total elimination of the Compass program, which is after-school programming that reaches 120,000 students each year. This is the magnitude of what we would have to do both in health and hospitals and beyond, because health and hospitals alone could not sustain this cut without even more profound setbacks to the health care of New Yorkers. That said, I want to be clear, we stand ready to work with the state to find solutions. Our Social Services Commissioner Steve Banks already helped the state to achieve $180 million in Medicaid savings. We believe there's at least $260 million more if the state will work with us. And the key point here, who runs Medicaid? The state of New York runs Medicaid. The state of New York sets the rules, the state of New York sets the rates. Handing the bill for the state's responsibility to the people of the city of New York or any other locality isn't right and isn't workable. There is no locality that could handle the fiscal impact of this cost switch, and even to achieve savings, which we stand ready to do, we can only do it with state cooperation. I believe there's 3 ways out of this situation. First, the Medicaid redesign team should work with localities to achieve real savings. Second, the state should revise the Medicaid global cap to reflect the health care that New Yorkers actually need and its real costs. And third, if we're going to make health care available for everyone who needs it, then we must ask the wealthiest among us to pay their fair share in taxes so that all can be healthy. Lives are literally on the line, and we urge the state to remove this cut to localities and safeguard public health by focusing on finding efficiencies and reforms in the state-run Medicaid program. Second potential risk is about the future of our children, $136 million shortfall for education, and real consequences for our kids in our schools. This would mean the equivalent of removing 400 social workers and guidance counselors from our schools. That is what this cut could lead to, in addition to ending programming for restorative justice that has been successful in reducing the need for suspensions and creating a safer school environment. Everyone here knows that we have still not gotten the resources, neither New York City nor Buffalo, Syracuse, Albany, none have gotten the resources promised by the Campaign for Fiscal Equity settlement, and we still need that. If we had that, we could bring 100% fair student funding to every school in New York City. Third, cuts to TANF. Last year, temporary assistance for needy families was slashed by 10%. This year, an additional 5% cut is proposed that will result in the loss of $100 million over 2 years. We would have to eliminate preventative services that help 5,500 children and help protect them from child abuse and neglect. Again, these cuts year after year are adding up and are going to take away our basic capacity to serve people. We urge you to restore this cut as well as the education cut I mentioned a moment ago. Very quickly, I need to note that there is an unrealistic deadline, and I have to say absurd penalties that have been proposed in the executive budget regarding the relocation of the Pier 76 tow pound. The executive budget imposed a $12 million fine on New York City with $3 million additional per month after the end of this year. It's utterly unrealistic. It literally would cause us to violate city law that requires a land use process for any such action to take place, and that process by law takes more than a year to begin with. This tow pound is basically the size of Union Square Park. Finding an alternative in and near Manhattan is a very complex undertaking. We need your help removing this unrealistic and I think from city perspective, unlawful act to penalize the city of New York. I know my time is short. I will only say very quickly by way of summary, we do agree with the executive budget on the proposal on e-bikes and e-scooters. We do agree with the executive budget on the legalization of the adult use of cannabis products. We want to make sure that there is also economic justice in what is done on that change. And then finally, I will run through very briefly some areas that we need your help in. First, homelessness. We are taking aggressive steps to end long-term homelessness in New York City, the most expansive strategy we've ever employed, the Journey Home vision announced in December. We ask that you support the Kruger-Hevesy Home Stability Support Act. This would allow us to keep 25,000 New Yorkers in their homes and out of shelter. We also ask your help addressing the question of the MTA. To this day, the MTA has only finished 30% of the projects delineated in its last capital plan, 380 projects out of 1,300 that were authorized in 2015. And yet the MTA is asking us for billions of dollars more in resources. I want to make clear to all of you, the last time we funded the MTA capital plan in 2015, that money has still not been spent by the MTA. Before the MTA asks for more money, we insist that they do an actual audit to determine the changes they need to become efficient. that they use the money we've given them before, they use the money that you rightly authorized last April, the new funding that will be coming to MTA, and that they commit to accountability and transparency that we have not seen previously from the MTA. I'll be very quick with your indulgence. We ask your continued commitment to the New York City Housing Authority and the 400,000 people who live there. The City of New York, because the federal government has stepped away from its obligations to public housing over years and years, decades, the City of New York has committed during my administration $6 billion to help improve and fix public housing. I want to commend the advocates and the elected officials all over the city, including Council Speaker Corey Johnson, who have been calling on the state to invest an additional $2 billion in NYCHA's capital needs. This would allow us to give you one example of the impact that would have to renovate 8,000 apartments and make them acceptable and quality housing that would reach 20,000 New Yorkers. I also want to note on the issue of criminal justice reform, my thanks again to the legislature for the actions you took last year, which were necessary and crucial and will help us advance justice and fairness and reduce mass incarceration. I believe it is important, however, for judges to have more flexibility, as I've said before, and I believe we can work together to find a solution acceptable to all. I also want to ask your help addressing what has become a crisis, the loss of small businesses all over New York City. I believe one of the solutions to save our mom and pop stores is to institute a vacancy tax. I want to thank Senator Hoylman and Assemblymember Glick for their proposal, which I agree with. Simply says if a landlord consistently leaves a storefront vacant for a prolonged period of time, blighting a community, keeping that storefront from a small business, undermining quality of life, that landlord should have to pay something more. I urge you to act on this proposal this session and in this budget, ideally. Finishing up, we have seen tremendous progress legislatively last year, what all of you did to protect millions of rent-regulated New Yorkers was one of the most profound acts in recent decades to keep New York City affordable. But there is more to be done. There's nearly 900,000 apartments that do not have protections. 2.5 million New Yorkers at this moment have no protection against rent gouging, have no guarantee that their lease will be renewed if they are acting appropriately, have no guarantee they will not be arbitrarily left on the street. We need universal renter protection. That legislation, to be effective, must include well-crafted exemptions, including for new construction and owner-occupied housing, and must ensure that the anti-gouging measure within is based in real and vigorous analysis. I also want to note on housing, we have an extraordinary opportunity to do something never done before in this city and state, which is to give people the opportunity to get an apartment without having to pay a traditional security deposit. There is a new approach which I support, which will allow people to pay very small monthly payments and avoid that overwhelming upfront cost that's made it impossible for so many people to get affordable housing. I urge you to act. Lastly, on property taxes, something I know there's tremendous concern on, not just in the Assembly and Senate, but in our communities. I've heard this at town hall meeting after town hall meeting. The City Council and I put together the first commission since 1993 to review this issue. Its preliminary report, 10 recommendations, would create the biggest reform in 40 years in our property tax system, would finally end the vast disparities between neighborhoods that are so unfair to so many of our constituents, would create the kind of consistency and transparency we need. We have made sure in the preliminary proposals, and the final proposals will be out in the months ahead, but the preliminary proposals speak very clearly to the need to protect seniors and low-income New Yorkers and folks who need to be exempted or treated differently in this process. And of course, this would be something that would be phased in mindfully. But we need property tax reform. It's a matter of basic fairness. I want to, in conclusion, thank everyone for the opportunity to bring the city's concerns forward to you. Today's hearing is part of what I could call a time-honored budget process, but there is nothing business as usual about the threat we face from the executive budget. I'll conclude as I began. This process involves a lot of dialogue and a lot of thoughtful questions and a real conversation about what's best for our people. But the executive budget has put into play a series of cuts that we have never seen before on this scale that could literally undermine the health care, the basic quality of life of millions of New Yorkers. We can't let that stand. I ask your help and support in addressing this urgent challenge. And with that, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you and look forward to your questions. And thank you, chairs, for your indulgence.
Thank you. We're going to go to our city's chair, Assemblyman Bronstein.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor, Ms. Hartzog, Mr. Floyd, thank you. In your testimony, you touched on what many here testifying with local governments today will agree is one of the most consequential aspects of the governor's proposal, which is the cost shift of local Medicaid growth. The governor has defended this proposal by arguing that since the state takeover of local Medicaid growth, I believe it was in 2015, local governments have lacked an incentive to rein in increased spending in Medicaid. He's described the situation as local governments suffering from what he calls blank check syndrome. Why is this characterization unfair, and what areas has the city identified as responsible for the growth in Medicaid?
Mr. Chair, it's just inaccurate. It doesn't represent reality. The state of New York runs the Medicaid program. The state of New York sets the rules, sets the rates. The localities act as enrollment agents. That said, we do believe there are ways that we can save money. We've proven it previously. We need the state's involvement. It's literally impossible to make those savings without the state being a partner. And I said, I think we believe right away there's another $250 million minimum that can be found in ongoing savings. But you kind of have to suspend belief here when you see some of these claims, because it doesn't bear any resemblance to reality. If the costs are being driven up because the minimum wage went up, well, I supported that minimum wage increase. That was not a decision that localities made. That was made here, rightfully. If the costs are going up because there's been an increase in enrollment, well, I think we all agree we want people to get health care. We want people to be insured. Most of that increase in enrollment has happened outside of New York City. And again, that means that in the suburbs and upstate, there's been a conscientious effort to ensure that those eligible actually got health care. I think an honest conversation is called for. And I think that the executive branch should accept responsibility for the program they run and then talk about the right ways to address it. I think there are 3 real savings that can be found, which we're going to work with them on, and I think other localities would happily do so as well, but we can't independently create savings out of thin air. Second, the cap. The cap is the fundamental problem here. We either believe that everyone who needs health care should get health care, or we don't. I think it's a consensus in this legislature. People who need health care should get it. The cap is standing in the way of that. It's an artificial restraint. It should be removed. And finally, we could all debate what kind of revenue, but I at least want to be constructive and say, if you say no, the only way out is new revenue, well, I still think it is a known fact and is something believed by independents, Republicans, Democrats alike, that the wealthy are not paying their fair share in taxes. And if the wealthy paid a little more so everyday people could have health care, I think that's a fair solution. So those are 3 ways in any combination that could get us out of this jam. But localities don't run the program. We need the solutions to come from Albany.
Sure. I agree with you, and I haven't heard any other outlet back up the governor's argument that it is the localities who are responsible for the increase in Medicaid growth. I just wanted to see your take on it. I do appreciate the fact that the city is working to recognize ways to address the Medicaid cost increases. In your testimony, you spoke about savings of $260 million that the city has identified. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yes, Mr. Chair. There are still, and again, this can only be done with the state because they control the program. And I'll note just to this question and the previous, there's been some allegation out there that the cities, welcoming people to sign up for Medicaid. Well, the state's doing the exact same thing, saying if someone qualifies, we will work with you to get you signed up. If you don't qualify, you don't qualify. Localities all over the state, Democratic and Republican-run, small, big jurisdictions are all saying the same thing. They can't understand what's happening here because we don't run the program. But we can help with savings, and the examples are, there's still people who move out of state, but they're not being captured in the data so they can be removed from Medicaid. There are classic bureaucratic problems like people who are deceased, checks still going to them. There's all sorts of basic efficiency that could be addressed. And we know there's also waste, fraud, and abuse, people trying to game the system that we want to crack down on and want to work with the state to crack down on. So just the basics alone, better joint efforts to weed out duplication and weed out any effort to undermine the system, that's $250 million right there, and we want to keep going. But I always say we're honest about what we run and what we don't. And if you have an issue with schools, come to me. With sanitation, come to me. With police or fire, come to me. But if you want to talk about how decisions are made on the Medicaid, the governor and the state run the Medicaid program. I just wish they would accept that responsibility and then talk about the constructive options, 3 of which I've outlined here, could get us all out of this crisis. If we don't, it means health care will be taken away from people. And I think New York State has prided itself against a backdrop of a country where there's been a huge debate over Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act, and you've seen states that literally said they would not participate in Medicaid expansion and left people without health care. New York State's been one of the leaders saying, no, we want people to have health care, we want people to have insurance. If we don't address this in the next months, you're going to see people starting to lose their health care.
Thank you, and we look forward to working with you on some of those proposed ideas to find savings. Regardless of who's responsible, there is sometimes a sense that the city economy is booming, and the city has a lot of tax revenue, and they could just afford to share some of the burden, considering we're facing a $6 billion budget deficit. Can you expand on how this cost shift would have tremendous implications for city services and how the city just cannot sustain adding this additional burden?
To those, I thank you for the question. To those who feel that, I would first say, look at the $1 billion plus in recurring cuts, meaning what's happened over recent years, it's taken over $1 billion every single year now out of our budget. So that's being paid by the taxpayers in New York City. More and more things are being picked up. We obviously have had unfunded mandates that we have to cover. This has been a recurrent reality. But on top of that, we are constantly aware that the city of New York has to address all the problems of the past that we've inherited. For example, the Health and Hospitals Corporation was near bankruptcy when I took office, was teetering on the brink. Same with the Housing Authority. We had to stop them both from going bankrupt, turn them around. In the case of Health and Hospitals, we've actually come a long way. It's not only solvent, it's becoming much more effective and efficient. We have a long way to go on the Housing Authority. But these are two entities that used to benefit from a tremendous amount of federal and state support that's just not the same anymore. If we don't keep them solvent and whole, you're talking about a tremendous decline in the quality of life for New Yorkers, and a city that is strong economically at this point, that the entire state depends on for economic growth and for tax revenue, would suffer deeply. Also, a reminder that we are the last line of defense for our people, meaning in the event of a global economic downturn, which by every economist's measure should happen at some point in the not-too-distant future. I don't wish for it. I'm knocking wood. I hope it never does, but it's been a long time since we had one. That's going to have a tremendous effect on the federal government and state government. That's going to reduce a huge amount of revenue for New York City right there. We would have very little left to protect our people with.
Just on that note, I have a minute left. Speaking of a potential of economic downturn, in November, the voters approved the creation of a rainy day fund. That's something that would have to come through the state. You didn't mention it in your testimony. Is that something the city is actively pursuing?
I would say, and I can tell that Budget Director wants to jump in, that one, we have the highest reserves we've ever had. Thank God, we've made that a crucial priority along with the council. But that is because we recognize how, in the event of a downturn, there would not be support available from other levels of government. And to keep city services going, police, fire, schools, we needed that deep reserve. So we've been doing that on our own, but let me have our Budget Director speak to it as well. Hold on.
I think that we're on.
Try it.
Yep, I'm on. So we are actively working with legislators to get a rainy day bill done. We want to make sure that we have the ability to both get our reserves as well as the rainy day fund. I think we want as much flexibility as possible when it comes to being able to access a rainy day fund. You don't know you're in a recession until you're actually in one, so we want to make sure that the city has the ability to access those funds before you actually get to that point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've been joined in the Assembly by Assemblyman Carroll, Assemblywoman Nolan, Assemblyman Teague, and we now go to the Senate for questions.
Thank you. We've been joined by Senator Felder, and our first questioner is Robert Jackson, Chair of Cities.
Good morning. How are you? I'm doing well, my friend. I think the microphone's not on, though, brother. There you go.
I got it. No, it's on. Let me thank you, and I'll turn to this one. This doesn't work too well. Hello? Hello? Much better. First, let me thank you for your leadership in New York City. Obviously, we need a progressive focus on the needs of New York City. And looking at at least the Medicaid budget situation we're in, it seems as though that New York City is being dumped on. And correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that's what I feel, and based on what I've heard from you, you feel that way also on behalf of New York City. Am I right or wrong?
You're right, Senator, and just want to add, I have talked to county executives, I've talked to mayors from all over the state, Democrats and Republicans alike, feel the exact same thing, that localities are being asked to deal with a cost that they cannot possibly handle. It's either going to bankrupt a lot of localities or they're going to have to take away health care from people who need it. That's happening all over the state because of this proposal.
So big or small, it doesn't matter. Everyone feels the same way based on your communication with locality leaders.
100% consistent, Senator.
So in listening to the governor when he had his State of the State address, he indicated that he was going to put this, MRT2 together with Dennis Rivera and the head of the Northwell Hospital, big conglomerates, but they would get a $2.5 billion cut that would have no negative impact on the people that we represent, as far as layoffs, anything else. Did you hear that, or did I hear something totally
Senator,
different?
I think you're right to say that is the ideal outcome, and I think there are specific ways that can be achieved, including removing the cap and getting additional revenue from those who have done very well. But my fear, Senator, is the mandate leaves open the possibility that if they cannot achieve that ideal, then the cuts would be passed on to localities. And I didn't say this in response, and I should have, to Assemblymember Bronstein, that the fact is that localities are paying that 25% as we always have. So I want no one to have the illusion that localities are not contributing a massive amount. Or we are certainly. The fact is, the growth is the question. And the state rightfully addressed that crisis years ago. I agreed with what the governor did back then, and I think he should stick with it, that growth was going to bankrupt localities, and it was necessary to have the state step in, or else you were not going to be able to give a lot of people health care.
What is the percentage of people in New York City? Because the governor talked about 3%, and if you get below that, then you will get save money and get some money. If you go beyond that, it has to come from out of your hide, and that's in the locality. What percentage of Medicaid is New York City?
I want our budget director to first tell you the base amount that we are paying every single year regardless, and then talk about that range you're discussing.
Hi, Melanie, how are you?
So our yearly contribution to Medicaid on an annual basis is $5 billion.
$5 billion.
$5 billion.
Every year.
The way that the proposal is currently written is if you are a locality and you exceed the 2% property tax cap, which
Can you
we do
pull the
not
mic a
have
little
in New York
closer to
City.
you?
Sorry?
Can you pull the mic a little closer to you?
Sure. The way that the proposal is written is if you exceed the 2% property tax cap, which we do not have in New York City, and you also exceed 3% growth in Medicaid year over year, you, locality, are responsible for 100% of the cost. For us, we estimate based on last year's growth, as reported by the state, that was 6.99%, which would then translate into what the mayor is discussing, which is another $1.1 billion hit to New York City in terms of our overall cost on Medicaid.
So if New York City had to absorb all of that, play that scenario out, how much money are we talking about?
So as the mayor discussed in his testimony, there is no ability for the health and hospital system to be able to absorb that level of cut without seriously having a detriment to the hospital system itself. So we would have to look across the board at a number of different city services. We talked about
I
having
mean,
to
city
close-
services, not to add, but to cut you're talking
cut,
about.
correct.
Is that correct?
And that would be reoccurring, also, as the mayor said, in the baseline each year. Closing of clinics, 19 clinics,
Is New York
elimination of
City-
after-school programming.
Is New York City being treated the same way as every municipality as far as the amount of income and that is being provided for Medicaid, or is New York City treated separately and apart from everyone else?
There is no other state that passes on the level of local share on Medicaid than New York State.
No other state?
Not at the level that we do pay, any locality. Obviously, we, New York City, pay a significant amount. As I said, it's at $5 billion annually for the cost of Medicaid.
So, in essence, do people think that New York City have an unlimited amount of money that we can pick off everything? I know New York City is a big city, the biggest, one of the biggest in the country, and I know we have a large budget, but do we have enough money to provide all of the things that are being required in this budget, along with not cutting services? That's a direct question I'm asking.
No.
The answer is no?
The answer is no. If we sustain this level of cut, we will have to reduce health care services for New Yorkers profoundly. Again, closing clinics, laying off doctors and nurses, and it goes beyond. It would affect our school system. It would affect our youth programming. We could not sustain $1.1 billion that is suddenly gone, has a seismic negative effect. And again, you've watched this, Senator. This is against the background of Health and Hospitals Corporation that just a few years ago was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, which, it is in the interest of everyone here that the million people who depend on it for health care have consistent quality health care, and that those public hospitals survive. This cut will fundamentally undermine that.
Mr. Mayor, let me turn to education. As you know, there is a lawsuit that is pending right now regarding the Campaign for Fiscal Equity under the Fair Student Funding Formula, and the City of New York is owed, depending on who you ask, $1.5 to $1.1 billion. Michael Rebell, the attorney that's handling the case, goes to trial in front of Supreme Court Justice Lucille Billings this fall. Has your office been involved in monitoring this case for the needs of the children of New York City?
Yes, Senator. It's a sad fact that you and Mr. Rebell and others need to keep fighting the same case you won so long ago. And you won fair and square, and the Court of Appeals said the Campaign for Fiscal Equity concept needed to be implemented. There was a settlement, but for a brief period of time, it has been ignored by the state of New York. So for all the folks who say, rightfully, they'd like to see all of our schools put on a perfectly equal footing with fair student funding, we could do that instantly if we were given our full CFE funding.
So let me switch to children with, that have IEPs. I'm reading here that in 2019, the State Education Department investigation found significant issues with New York City special education hearings, and as of January 2020 in New York City, there were more than 10,000 open IHO cases and 6,000 late cases. the total number of late cases and open cases, and New York State, the rest of the state was only 250. Why is that, understanding that children that have IEPs need help, and they need it now, and they can't wait 3 or 4 years for the services that they need to have?
I'll start very quickly and pass to the Budget
Sure.
Director. Senator, I know it's been a deep concern to the legislature, and we've been working together. The number of those cases has been steadily reduced. We've moved away from parents having to use the legal system. There is much more. We are deprogramming, to be very blunt, a very cynical strategy that used to be employed by the Department of Education in the previous administration to overtly deny parents special education as a budget action, as a way of saving money rather than serving parents and children. We have steadily increased, and the Budget Director will tell you how much more money we're spending every single year because we've opened up those gates and made sure that people are getting it. But we have more to do for sure.
Just please make sure that you put as many staff there in order to deal with those cases. This is extremely important for the parents of the thousands and thousands of students with IEPs. You don't need to go and give me that, but I just want you to say you need to focus more on that. My last question before the time runs out is, has the MTA provided any of the information you sought as a condition for your city's contributing $3 billion in the 2020-24 capital plan? Have the MTA provided any of that information that you requested?
No. The simple answer is no. Although we work with them consistently, we're trying to have a productive relationship. The central thing we asked for was an audit, and I know you all asked for it too, an audit that would actually go at the central question of why are they wasting so much money? Why do their projects take so long? What's it going to take to fix it? That was the audit we expected. What came back was an audit that literally evaded those simple questions that none of us would be able to defend. And so we have consistently asked the MTA to do a real audit that would tell them how to start spending taxpayer money effectively. We're still waiting for that answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairs.
Thank you. We go now to Assemblyman Thiel.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning.
I chair local governments, which Mr. Braunstein has cities. I've got counties, towns, villages. Counties obviously have the same issue, as you mentioned before, regardless of political persuasion, big counties, small counties, with regard to the Medicaid proposal.
Yes.
And I share your feeling that this is simply a cost shift to local governments if this proposal goes through. And further, I think, is a shift, at least in the case of counties, to a less progressive tax base where it's going to get paid for with sales taxes and property taxes. Just a couple of questions just to kind of flesh out some of the things that were in your testimony. You said there should be a revision to the Medicaid global cap. Any sense of where what you think that revision should look like, what that percentage should be?
I will start, and the Budget Director wants to add that, look, I think the cap was artificial against the backdrop of trying to make sure that people got health care and the backdrop of a perfectly legitimate, appropriate action, which was increasing the minimum wage. So I think the cap itself as a concept is standing in the way of the basic mission of ensuring that all New Yorkers get health care. So that's my broad statement. Do you want to add?
I would just say that it needs to be revisited. It's been some time since that cap was actually set, and since that time, costs have grown. And I think across the state, it's primarily been in long-term care, both in terms of enrollees based on the state's program of actually enrolling individuals and having individuals who are taking care of caregivers or parents, et cetera, at home. That program has grown. It's a state-run program, and the costs have grown for that program overall. So I think it needs to be revisited overall, and I believe the Commissioner for State Department of Health at the hearing also acknowledged that fact as well.
And Mr. Chair, very quickly, your point I want to amplify. For a lot of localities, if this is not addressed, the only places they can turn are an increase in property tax, which is unacceptable to localities and to citizens all over the state, increase in sales tax, which is regressive. We are staring at the solutions, which are greater efficiency together, raising that cap, and getting, if we need new revenue, getting it from those who have done very, very well. But I fear that a fiction is being created that somehow localities did this. They didn't. And somehow localities could swallow the cost. They can't. They're either going to run out of money entirely or have to turn to taxpayers who are already overburdened at the local level.
Well, and you mentioned, I concur also that local governments, counties, the city of New York don't have control over these costs. And two of the things that I think have been mentioned that do contribute, that you don't control, are simply the increase in healthcare costs to begin with, and also the efforts that I think everybody has made is to get health coverage for as many people as possible, so the increase in enrollment. From the viewpoint of administering the program, do you have a sense of those cost drivers that you don't control, but obviously you see by administering the program, whether what is the relative importance or the relative contribution to the increase of healthcare inflation or increase in costs, and how much is because of increased enrollment? Do you have a sense of that?
I'll turn to the budget director, but say, one thing we know for sure is that combination, again, of a good action, the increase in the $15 minimum wage, to the $15 wage, and another good action, getting people health care coverage upstate and in suburban areas. That's where the growth has been primarily. And that means people needed health care who qualified are getting it. So there's always these attempts to create differences and divisions around the state. I think we should stand in unity here and say it's in all of our interests, every single one of us, that people get health care. And if the expansion has occurred in areas outside New York City, we don't begrudge that. We say, good, that means people are getting what they need. But Melanie can add.
One of the biggest areas of growth, as I mentioned, is the state-run program. It's long-term health care. These are for people who have multiple health care needs, who are being cared for in their home or in other settings, nursing homes. That's the biggest area that we've seen of growth, both in enrollment in terms of cost, even with the state setting the capitated rates. That's been one big area. And I just asked my staff for this, and of the growth that we've seen, it accounts for about $1 billion worth of the growth.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senate.
Thank you. Sorry, Senator James Corrin.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor. How are you?
Morning.
I think we all share best wishes and our sympathy to the police families and police officers who are out there every day doing all they can to protect us. So,
Thank you very much,
thank
Senator.
you for mentioning that. I think we can all agree that this is a difficult fiscal time with a $6.1 billion deficit that we're facing in this state, and a good part of it is the Medicaid costs, and I think part of that also is that medicine is better, or our healthcare system improves, and people live longer, and the costs go up. So I think we always have to factor that, but I think we also have to look at the changes in the federal tax law. The Trump limitation to just $10,000 for both state and property taxes, puts an enormous burden on the taxpayers at all levels, and I think that's a major reason, why we are facing some of the crisis that we do here. So I guess one of my questions is, most of the counties, outside the cities, have been able to pretty much manage within the 2% property tax cap. And as you know, in places like Long Island, where I represent, the property tax burden is significant. It's huge. Have you ever looked at how they're able to do that? And are there any thoughts that maybe you might be able to come up with some savings as part of the solution to this problem?
Senator, I would say it's a fair question, but I would just make very clear we have such a different reality. As you know, property taxes are a piece of our revenue, but we have much more of a reliance on income tax than some other parts of the state. And that is a progressive tax. That means that those who've done very well are paying as they should. I think it's fair to say that also we have extraordinary challenges in New York City. Look, we have the finest police force in the world, 36,000 members, 2,000 more on my watch than when I started, but that costs an immense amount of money. And we have to not only protect our own 8.6 million people, but millions who come in to work each day and millions who come visiting. So there's a lot of extraordinary situations affecting New York City. As you're seeing in the global health crisis, we pay extraordinary costs that other places often don't have to. we also deal with a level of need. Every community, I've spoken to mayors and county executives all over the state, everyone deals with challenges and needs. We know we have a disproportionate level of need in New York City. We end up having to pay for that. So I think it's fair to say that our revenue approach works for us. Other places have a different reality. But I assure you, we are always trying to find ways to save and to solve problems in ways that save taxpayers money in the long run. But the difference here on the Medicaid issue is that localities were never going to be able to handle this kind of increase. That's why, and I think the governor was right to do it most of a decade ago when he stepped in and said this is going to be an unworkable situation. He was right.
Just a quick follow-up. You mentioned that you lack control. Are there some rules and regulations and some suggestions that perhaps you could bring forward where we can work with you to come up with some savings?
Absolutely, Senator. And the first, as I mentioned in the testimony, the fact there's been almost so far almost $200 million in savings we did achieve working with the state. Another $260 million that we proposed that with not a lot of effort, with some cooperation, we could achieve together. I think there's a lot of area for improvement if there's cooperation.
Good. And then finally, you briefly touched on criminal justice reform. Would you like to elaborate a little bit in terms of not only the situation with bail, but also some of the costs and issues that we're dealing with the discovery reform?
Yes, Senator. I said last year, and I reiterate, that what the legislature's done absolutely crucial to justice and fairness and reducing mass incarceration. I commend the legislature for its actions on bail reform and discovery. There have been real cost dynamics with discovery that localities are all grappling with as an unfunded mandate. There have been timing dynamics that have been very sharp and sudden that localities are trying to deal with. The idea is absolutely the right direction, but there's a lot of practicalities that we're all struggling with. On bail, the issue to me actually is something I felt long before bail reform became a possibility. I said it back in 2015 after one of our police officers, Randolph Holder, was killed by someone who I think should have been held in because he had a very substantial history that proved he was a threat to the community. I think there's a form of judicial discretion with appropriate checks and balances, really clear guardrails that will help us to address some of the outstanding issues. Every piece of legislation, including the very best pieces of legislation, still we have to find out in practice what works. Sometimes there's unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
I think judicial discretion is the way to address this.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Madam Chairs.
Thank you. Assembly.
We've been joined by Assemblywoman Fernandez, Assemblywoman Simon, and we go to Assemblyman Fall for questions.
Although I have to jump in, Jamal Bailey from the Senate. I'm sorry, Assembly Member. Jamal Bailey also has arrived.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for being here and your team for their responsiveness for any of my inquiries. Before I get into my questions, I do want to just thank you for adding a fast ferry program that's going to be coming into my district by the end of this year. The committed funding for Cromwell, which is exciting for the community since they've been asking it for many years. The level of funding for the Port Richmond High School Athletic Complex, I'm hearing about it every single week from students over there. And of course, we're hoping to work on Curtis High School next. And of course, the success of universal pre-K. I see it on an everyday basis, especially when my daughter questions me every morning on where am I going. So my first question is related to the Jersey Street sanitation garage. I believe there was an agreement to transfer or relocate the property to Fresh Kills, and I'm just curious to know if there's like a timeline for that project.
I'm going to let our State Legislative Director speak to that.
Okay.
Yes. So right now, the DDC groundbreaking for the Fresh Kills project is slated for a spring completion in 2023.
Gotcha. All right. Goodhue Park. And when looking at Goodhue, a lot of folks that they think about what happened at Mount Marissa, and they don't want something like that to ever happen again. So, is there any update on when the property will be transferred over to the city?
We hope to be able to have a number with you within the next 2 weeks, as far as the timeline.
No problem. indoor pool. Of course, Staten Island does not have a public indoor pool facility. And I know there was a commitment made to construct one. Any idea of a site has been selected and a timeline on when we could probably expect shovels in the ground?
Yes. So we broke ground in May of 2019 for about 19.5 million on the music hall. And
No, wait,
then-
this is a different matter. You were
Oh,
talking, I just want to make sure we're not misunderstanding the question. You were talking about the indoor pool.
Indoor pool, correct?
Right. On the indoor pool, that plan is proceeding. Money is in the budget. That site at Goodhue is being proceeded on.
Okay, very good. Snug Harbor, so, you know, everybody knows Snug Harbor is a very popular destination on Staten Island. There is, of course, significant capital funding needed there, under great leadership, and with the amount of investment needed for Snug Harbor, I was curious to know if this would be possible to include Snug Harbor in the One NYC plan, since that is a plan that talks about the city's future.
You're saying to include it in the One NYC vision? Yeah, I need to check what we had in the last one, if it was specific to Snug Harbor, but you can
Yeah.
speak to the broad situation.
So certainly happy to take a look at it. As far as the One NYC project, though that plan is already out, as far as a longer-term vision in terms of what we can be able to do for your community, we're definitely happy to take a look at it. And this project is sort of, aligned with those goals. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to affirm, it's an absolutely crucial cultural resource for Staten Island, but for the whole city. So you know that there have been a lot of issues at Snug Harbor where we had to intervene to help shore things up. We did that absolutely willingly, knowing how important it is to the people of Staten Island.
Yes, and I want to thank you, for your involvement in that. And as far as the Medicaid and, foundation aid, I think it's, state needs to implement and exhaust reforms and efficiencies before implementing cuts to localities, and it's clear that both the federal and state control the Medicaid program, and their action have been a primary driver of funding spending. So I'm going to also echo Senator Jackson's comments on foundation aid. It's critical that we keep pushing for additional increase in this year's budget, and I'm of course looking forward to working with you and my colleagues to address these important matters.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senate.
Thank you. Senator John Liu.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Senator.
I heard all your comments about the governor's budget proposal. Do you feel like it's e pluribus unum? You don't have to answer if you don't
I was
want
going to
to.
say, Senator, you've always had a way with words. I'll tell you, there is an e pluribus
They're not my
unum.
words, they're the governor's words.
No, there
What
is
do you
an e
think?
pluribus unum, which is to see states and localities all over New York State, Democrat and Republican, small towns, big cities, everyone unified, that this is a danger to our local budgets and to our ability to provide health care. This proposal would undermine all of us. So actually, it does unite the entire state.
All right. Quick question about the MTA capital program. You were asked earlier about the upcoming capital program, but what about the one that we're just finishing up? $2.5 billion the city still owes?
No, Senator, $2.5 billion that we provided that the MTA has still not fully utilized off
So
the
the-
previous.
So the city of New York is fully paid up on its contribution to the
City of New York has, and the budget
to the
director will explain.
2015-2019 capital program.
What's shocking to me, and the budget director will speak to you, I know, former controller, you are budget-minded, but I'll say, literally, they haven't been able to spend all the money we gave them in 2015. That's how inefficient the situation is.
So in the preliminary budget, we added $1.23 billion. This was for the 2015-2019 plan, as the mayor discussed in his testimony. They're about 30% complete with all the projects for that plan, which they announced in 2015. And there's remains $600 million left towards the overall city's commitment for the 2015-2019 plan related to joint ventures, economic development initiatives. That's still outstanding.
Okay, thank you. My last point I wanted to make with you is that, first of all, I want to congratulate you. You made good on a promise. You promised to look at the property tax system And you actually did.
Thank you.
Not easy.
No.
And it's eluded many, many mayors, so congratulations on that.
Thank you, Senator.
Now, you know it's going to be a tough slog.
Yes, sir.
The initial recommendations talk about how to basically mark everything up to market, which means there's going to be huge swings, as our chairman, Brian Benjamin, knows about, huge swings for homeowners. But at the same time, and part of that is because the commission is recommending the elimination of the assessed value growth caps. But yet, there's going to be another program that provides a homestead exemption to counter exactly the impacts of eliminating the assessed value growth caps. On top of that, there's going to be an examination of the property tax bill as compared to incomes, particularly low-income primary resident owners. So, I mean, all this sounds great, but how can it actually be done?
Our budget director was an ex officio member of the commission, so she can speak to the specifics. But I would say, Senator, a lot of care was taken to actually address the central problem, was the disparity between neighborhoods, and what was consistently felt to be a very untransparent system. But we knew in doing that we had to buffer the impact, particularly for seniors, lower income folks, and bring this in over a period of time. So where you started, exactly right. This is extraordinarily difficult to do, and there are a lot of moving parts, but I think where it adds up is we address the sort of the original sin problem of the disparity between neighborhoods first and foremost.
I mean, thank you, Mr. Mayor. With all due respect to your budget director, I know she's very capable, because I have limited time here. I just want to say that the recommendations sound great, but I don't know how workable they really are. I mean, one of the main reasons why we have such disparate property tax bills is something that you've enjoyed, but you're perfectly willing to give up.
Yeah.
Properties, homes worth millions of dollars pay the same property tax bill that homes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars pay. That is a very glaring discrepancy and disparity. The elimination of the growth caps will help that, but the growth caps themselves were not that difficult to understand. You're going to replace that with another system that over time is also going to be very, very difficult to understand. My last suggestion for you is that there are still significant properties in the city of New York which I think the average New Yorker would consider to be profitable, even though they're technically nonprofit. And specifically, we're talking about some private universities as well as private hospitals that don't pay any property tax bills. And yet, if we were somehow able to have them pay their fair share, perhaps they could bring in billions of dollars that they probably should, and we can level the playing field for all other New Yorkers as well.
Thank you.
We go to Assemblyman Schmidt.
Mr. Mayor, thank you. Obviously, these attempted assassinations over the last few days of our hero NYPD officers has struck a nerve throughout the country, particularly in Orange County, where I represent. Many of your officers live and their families live. And I'm getting calls, messages, emails of distraught family members, distraught officers who are disgusted and upset and feel threatened by what is happening in the last couple of hours, last couple of days. And they're looking for answers. And the police commissioner himself stated that rhetoric and words matter, and that the anti-police rhetoric that we've seen at protests, that we've seen for the last couple of months, last couple of years, having escalated, has really contributed to this crisis. And on behalf of my constituents who serve your city, they would like an answer. How are we going to combat this? How are we going to end the hate on one of the most diverse law enforcement agencies in the world, and allow these heroes to do their job and not shed another drop of blood protecting our city?
Thank you. Assemblymember, I agree with the way you have framed this. And not only Commissioner Shea, but I said, this absolutely unacceptable. Even in a democratic society where we value the individual freedom of speech, it's unacceptable to attack police officers who are there to protect and serve us. We need to use every tool. If any of these individuals commit a crime, and we know in recent protests some did, we're going to make sure they face the full consequences. But I think the thing that we can all do as leaders is, one, draw a line and say, you have a right to protest. You don't have a right to affront those who are serving us. It's not going to help anyone's cause, and it disgusts the people of our city. I guarantee you it disgusts the people of our city. You know those recent protests where they called everyone to come out? Almost no one came. It's such a small, horrible group, but a very small group who feel that way. And then second is to do what I have seen with Commissioner Bratton, Commissioner O'Neill, and now Commissioner Shea, which is to rebond our police and our communities deeply. Not only have we driven down crime for 6 years, but we have brought police and community into a much deeper alignment. Once our officers get to know communities better and communities get to know officers better, there's a much greater feeling of solidarity. And that's part of how we overcome that hatred. That, again, the folks who feel that hatred are very few, but they're doing something very negative. And I understand why officers are pained deeply by that rhetoric, but also when they see these attacks. So I guarantee you, Commissioner Shea, who has spent his entire adult life in the NYPD, started out walking a beat in the South Bronx, he will take every measure to protect our officers. I will support every measure to protect our officers.
Thank you, Mayor. Pull factors. Are you aware of what immigration pull factors are?
Again, sir?
Immigration pull factors. Are you aware of that law enforcement term?
Don't know if I know that term.
Okay, so pull factor, an immigration pull factor is an official action or rhetoric, a government action or rhetoric that incentivizes individuals to immigrate, many times illegally immigrate, and it's a big cause of the surge of immigration on our southern border over the last year. This is per federal law enforcement. We have multiple issues in that regard, but in New York, we are one of the most sought-after destinations because of the creation of pull factors. In August, I toured our U.S.-Mexican southern our border with federal, local, and state law enforcement down in Texas, and they mentioned many New York City policies. While I was there, your NYCHA housing lotteries for those who are non-citizens and in the country illegally, sanctuary city policies, as well as medical coverage proposals, as ways that cartels are able to entrap more individuals, men, women, and children, into their into their exploitation to cross our border illegally and then enter into New York, endangering their lives. I would like to bring that to your attention. This is something that is used, and it is of grave concern for our law enforcement at the southern border, and they point to New York pull factors as what's endangering many of these men, women, and children. No one's crossing the border without cartels' influence, and I would just like to hear your response to that and any ways we could mitigate that going forward.
Assemblymember, when I hear you describe that, I take it very seriously, because if organized crime is manipulating people in any way, that's all of our concern. If we see people taken advantage of, that's all of our concern. But I want to affirm the policy NYPD, because I think, I appreciate your question, I appreciate I can tell it is a very heartfelt question. But I do think that the backdrop, this whole national discussion has missed something very important. We've got about 12 million people who have been here for decades and decades. That number hasn't changed appreciably. In New York City, we got about 500,000 people who are undocumented. That number hasn't changed appreciably. The fact is, whether we like it or not, our entire economy is based on 12 million people who are part of our communities. And we have not, as a nation, come to grips with it. So I would argue to you, what we see every day is, in fact, hardworking people, the vast, vast majority, who come here just like our ancestors came here, and are part of our communities, and that's why the NYPD, going back decades, under Republican and Democratic mayors, has not asked documentation status. And if you ask my commissioners, they've been very blunt with me about this. These are lifelong police professionals. The minute they start asking documentation status of undocumented people, a lot of their ability to police New York City will collapse, because they will not have witnesses who come forward, they will not have folks who are victims of crime who come forward, they won't have cooperation. So it's a complex backdrop, but I would argue to you, If we all together, and I think it is possible, if we all together would agree that to normalize the folks who are here because they're really not going anywhere, except for those who have committed serious and violent crimes who should be out of here. But if we can normalize this situation, then you wouldn't have that concern, very honest concern you're raising. That wouldn't be a factor anymore if we would just normalize the reality of the people who are already a part of our country.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'll be happy to follow up with your staff on the pull factor issue.
I appreciate that.
Thank you, Senate.
Thank you. Thank you. We are next, our next questioner is Brian Benjamin.
Thank you, Mr. Bowles. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for being here. I have a couple of questions for you. I'll try to do them quickly because the time is running. First, I want to start off with property taxes. I have, as the chair of the Committee on Budget and Revenue, had a number of roundtables and forums across the city on this topic. And the two things that I heard the most about was, one, the fairness argument, and second, sort of how much property tax people are paying. So I have two questions for you. As it relates to, from the fairness standpoint, the commission's report that I saw addressed that with one of the points, which basically would say that property taxes, instead of being assessed at this assessed value, would be at market value. One of the concerns people have asked about that is, will there be a sort of increase for some folks who have been sort of paying less than they should, and then a decrease for others? In other words, I know you have a 30 billion or whatever that number is. You're trying to solve for that number, and so you would just realign it so that some will pay more, some will pay less, but you'll get to that same number?
Yes. Again, our budget director knows a lot more about the nuances, but I will say, as a layman,
yep.
And I've been real plain about it. Where I live, in my neighborhood in Brooklyn, my home's value is not reflected accurately. I should be paying more. For folks who live near me who are lower income or seniors, we have ways to address and buffer that impact so they are not hurt. But I should be paying more. And a lot of people in my neighborhood should be paying more. And there's a lot of people in other neighborhoods who are paying a disproportionately high rate. We got to balance that while keeping the basic overall revenue essentially the same. But at least everyone will see some movement in favor of fairness.
Sure. Okay. Next question. One of the things that was also mentioned was the idea of a property tax cap. Some of the low-income homeowners have said it would be great if you could do the realignment, and then also they have some sort of sense of consistency of how high that can grow. So regardless of how much the city's spending might grow, their property taxes would have some sort of cap. Has that been something you considered? I didn't see it as one of the options in the report.
No, and I'll tell you why. Because, again, we're different, being the last level of government, for the people. We have to solve the people's needs and address their needs. Property tax cap, under certain circumstances, means you cannot address policing needs, fire, schools. You end up in scenarios with tough budget times where you have no choice. We saw this in California, the great model for this country of what not to do, where even when there were glaring needs in communities, they could not address them because they had a cap on taxation. We believe that New York City is succeeding right now because we have invested in police, we have invested in education, we have invested in affordable housing, and it is undergirding our economic success. And if we were to take those things away because we were forced to by a cap, we would actually start sliding backwards. So right now we have the strongest economy we've probably ever had in our history. I'm proud to say over 500,000 new jobs since I became mayor. And we're throwing off a lot of revenue for the rest of the state, which is good for everyone. But if we start to undercut that, and I think a reduction in services would undercut that, a reduction in quality of life would undercut that, we'll rue the day. So no, that is not something we are considering.
Thank you. All right, moving on to small businesses. You mentioned the thoughts and concern about small businesses. One of the things I've heard from a number of folks is small businesses trying to get contracts and work with the city. And as you know, there's a significant amount of activity happening at NYCHA and other places, but particularly at NYCHA, where you are bringing in a lot of sort of private, whether it's nonprofit or for-profit folks to sort of participate in the RAD and other things. has your administration thought very carefully around sort of how people are being assessed for these projects, and who's owning and controlling from the partnership with the city side those kinds of projects? Because it's something that's obviously of concern as you're talking about NWBEs participating in sort of on the marketplace. Are there opportunities really happening with some of these projects?
I'll start quickly, and my colleagues can add if they choose. Our MWBE commitment overall to get to 30% of city contracting has been moving very steadily, and thanks to the legislation that you all passed, which really gave us opportunity to move forward. That includes, obviously, what's going on through NYCHA, so there has been more and more spending going to MWBs. I think your question is well taken. We have to ensure that we do that with every piece of the equation, and MWBs often equal small businesses, and it's a double benefit and keeps that money circulating in our economy. So I think, yes, we're moving in the right direction. I think you're right to say, are we doing it every time we can do it? We need to keep the pressure on to make that happen. The other thing I should note, one of the things I announced in my State of the City address is we're also going to take city pension funds. And we believe that right away we can take $500 million in city pension funds and invest them in small businesses in New York City that can give us a good rate of return, but also help those small businesses thrive and employ New Yorkers. So there's a lot of these pieces we have to use our own resources to help our own people.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Passing to the Assembly.
Assemblywoman Malliotakis.
Good morning, Mayor. I want to first thank you also for the Property Tax Commission, because it was a couple of years ago at this very hearing that I held up your bill and my bill and said, hey, why am I paying $2,000 more despite my property being a third of the value? So I appreciate you actually putting forth the commission. I read the recommendations. The recommendations are actually, some of them are recommendations that I made myself, so I appreciate that. And I look forward to its implementation. However, you know that it's going to take approximately 5 years. You may not be mayor anymore. Well, hopefully you're not going to be mayor anymore.
I was
at that
going to
time.
say,
you're not going to pull a Bloomberg.
I believe in term limits.
You won't be pulling a Bloomberg on us. But what I would say is I also very much support and encourage a 2% property tax cap like nearly every other municipality in the state. As you know, the property tax levy has gone up over 50% since you've taken office, and I would like to know what would be the percentage that you intend to increase that. And I don't really buy the argument that you can't do a cap, because like I said, every other municipality in the state has a 2% cap. They're operating under it. And the budget has gone up from $70 billion when you came into office to $95 billion, which is quite a large increase. In fact, we have the same budget as the city has the same budget as the state of Florida, despite them having 2 million more residents. And so I'm really concerned about you saying that you cannot do this cap, because I think it really is critical to provide some relief for individuals who are truly struggling. The middle class, the lower income, middle income communities that I represent are struggling to pay their property tax bills. 2% cap until the changes are made would go a very long way in providing relief.
Well, I'm confident, thank you, Assemblymember, I'm confident with your help and everyone's help that we can get these changes made. And it's something I'm very devoted to. So I want to say to you, I know you've cared deeply on this issue. I thank you for that. And we should get this done while I'm still mayor. And I want to make that argument very plain. I do believe in term limits. I will not pull a Bloomberg, as you said. But in fact, it is a mayor in their second term who can withstand some of the typical pressures that might dissuade someone from action. So I'm going to be fighting hard for this. I believe there's a lot of energy in the legislature to address this, and we can do something historic. To your question, no, I'll tell you, I just don't agree with the cap. And you represent a district with so many public servants.
Yeah.
I think if I said to your public servants, if I said to the police officers, the firefighters, the sanitation workers, hey, if you were going to save on your property tax bill, but it could lead to a much smaller workforce, how would you feel? I think people would say, no, wait a minute, we don't want to see a reduction. I told you, I've added 2,000 more police officers on patrol.
Yep.
That cost real money, but I think it was absolutely the right thing to do, and we've seen it in a safer city, safest big city in America. So I would argue to you, we need to make a fundamental decision. Do we want the quality of life, the quality of service, the kind of workforce we have, or do we want something different? If you say you want a property tax, we cannot have what we have right now. I truly believe that.
Yeah, well, I think, it's funny how you always mention the critical services like sanitation and police. And I think New York City certainly was doing that with the $70 billion budget they had back in 2013. I'm talking about a 35% increase in spending, where certainly there are ways, and if you want, you and I can sit down, we can go over ways where we can actually save money for spending in the city budget. And when we talk about the $1.4 billion hole, let's add up just the Thrive NYC money and the Renewal Schools money, you got your $1.4 billion right there. But in all honesty, I think a 35% increase in spending is a tremendous amount, and it's on the backs of my constituents and those who, everyone else here represents them. And by the way, it's not just the homeowners. It's being passed on to those renters as well. Obviously, those property tax costs are being passed on. So it's increasing spending costs, for everyone who lives in New York City. And I think there are places where we can cut costs or be more efficient, and it doesn't have to be those basic services that government should be providing. So I'd ask you again, and my last question is, what is the exact percentage that you intend, as the budget proposal that you have stands, to increase the property tax levy this year? Because again, it was 50% increase since 2013. So what percentage are you intending to increase
let's
it this
be
year?
clear. We have not increased the rate during my entire
You haven't
time
increased
as
the
mayor.
rate. You increased the percentage of the levy, which is the amount of money that you
I want
seek
to
from
be clear
property
because I just don't
taxpayers.
want there to be misunderstanding out there.
Yep.
In my time as mayor, unlike my predecessor, we did not increase the property tax rate.
That's
We
correct.
have
You increased the levy.
We have seen the values of property increase steadily. That's the reality.
You've increased the
And-
levy by 50%.
But again, I'm making a very clear point.
Okay.
We want a fairer system. We can do that altogether. But I'm going to defend vehemently that if you have a city that has the strongest economy it's ever had, more jobs than ever, safest big city in America, and a school system that continues to improve, these things cost money. And I do not want us to slip backwards. We have to make these investments for the good of everyone.
Could you just answer the initial question, which is how much you intend to raise the property tax levy, which is the amount of money the city seeks from property taxpayers this year?
Again, we are acting on a system right now that is affected by values and standards for each neighborhood, but not in a fair manner. This is not something we sit around and say, we're going to take this much more from people. We want to stop that practice.
Thank you. Thank you. We've been joined by Assemblywoman Seawright and Assemblyman Jacobson. We now go to the Senate.
Thank you. Senator Zelnor Myrie.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your testimony. I just wanted to ask very briefly, and forgive me if this has been asked already, the impact that the cuts to TANF will have on communities, particularly the ones that I represent with high usage of this assistance.
At this level with TANF, so again, there was a 10% cut last year. And that's permanent. We'll have to keep paying that. 5% more has been proposed now. $100 million that would mean over 2 years. That means we would have to eliminate preventive services. And I want to emphasize, for a lot of people care deeply about protecting kids who are vulnerable. 5,500 kids, that is the equivalent of the preventive services for 5,500 kids that are there to stop child abuse, stop neglect, keep families from falling apart. This is very real stuff. And I think what's happened is, like TANF, people hear TANF, they can't relate to it, and the cuts keep rolling in. And New York City taxpayers have to keep picking it up. That's what it would mean in human terms if this cuts go through.
So is it fair to say that the executive budget as proposed would take food off the table for the most vulnerable folks in our city?
I would say it a little differently. It would undermine the health and safety of our children if those TANF cuts go through. In some ways, it's even worse than taking food off the table. It's literally taking away our ability to protect them.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly.
We go to Assemblyman Carroll.
Just in time.
Just in the nick of time. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for being with us this morning. And I want to give you a giant thank you for what you did last week in your State of the City address about talking about the stoppage of building out fossil fuel infrastructure.
Thank you.
It is necessary. That kind of bold action is what we need to hear. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
My next question or praise goes to your other bold idea around making sure that every second grader by 2024 is reading. We're not there. We're nowhere close. 73% of fourth graders and eighth graders read below a proficient level. That's below grade level. This is a crisis. Your school's chancellor did something phenomenal 3 weeks ago, and that was to have the first pilot program for a dyslexia screener in my district at 2 schools. This screener costs $2,000 to administer. We could administer a screener for every single child in New York City in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, for a few $1,000,000. Why can't we do that by the end of this year? Why can't we make sure that everyone is reading and then take the bold steps to introduce evidence-based reading curriculum that looks at the science of reading and make sure that we use multisensory sequential phonics when we are mitigating and remediating troubled readers, especially dyslexic readers, which are 20% of our school-age children. I hope you'll take that bold step because your chancellor has started it. I hope you can finish it. It will change the lives of hundreds of thousands of students. It changed my life. And the unfortunate thing is that the only people's lives who are being changed right now look like me. They're affluent kids, they're disproportionately white, but it's 1 in 5 students. And you have the power. The science is there, the evidence is there. I hope you stand up, and I hope you do that.
Thank you, Assemblymember. I appreciate this point very much. We have a long way to go on reading. I'm not going to, for a moment, underestimate that. We have made some very, very big progress. We have a long way to go. I will tell you, I mentioned in my state of the city, the reading coaches that are now in hundreds of schools that were not there before, and those are schools with the greatest need, are making a huge difference. So this is one piece of the puzzle. But I have to tell you, your proposal is powerful. And to the best of my memory, I have not heard it said as clearly and powerfully as that this might be another major way to contribute at something we could do and afford. So I will bring that back immediately. I could see it being a very effective approach, and I appreciate it.
Mr. Mayor, 9 other states do it. Mississippi, of all places, instituted this 5 years ago and has seen the greatest gains in reading performance in the nation. Mississippi, the entire state, currently has better reading scores than New York City. Think about that.
No, I take that.
This is the vanguard, and I know that we can do this. If we can do it in Mississippi, and it's not just Mississippi, it's throughout the nation. It's states large and small. It's school districts from across the spectrum. It is what we need to change the scores of countless students. And it works. The evidence is there. The science is there. It is what we need. And it is something that I am passionate about because if not for it, I would not be sitting in front of you. It is the inequity, it is the inequality issue of the day. Because the only students who are receiving the appropriate education are those students that are rich and savvy. And that is so unfortunate. It's so unfortunate. It is leaving countless students to have academic careers that are riddled with struggle when it does not have to be. Because when you remediate a young reader in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, the brain's plasticity is such that you can bring that child up to grade level. You can make that child a good academic student. If you wait for them to fail at 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, it is so much harder to remediate. And oftentimes, those students never get remediated and they drop out of school and they have a life of continued struggle.
I appreciate it. I will tell you, I'll pledge to you, Assemblymember, that as we prepare for executive budget in April, I'll bring this back to the Chancellor. We're going to have a very serious conversation about it. I like what I'm hearing, honestly. I will always tell you when I don't know all the facts, but I can tell you that you're raising something that sounds to me like it could be really profound. I will finish by saying we do not accept a school system where only the privileged can get a quality education. We just don't. And that's why we've been trying to change New York City public schools to the core. But you make a very compelling argument, and if this is a way to, I believe in early childhood education. We've tried to reorient everything towards earlier grades. If this is a way to supercharge that and identify ways that we could help kids that we've been missing, I love it. Let me see if we can get something done quickly on this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senate.
Thank you. Excuse me. Senator Gustavo Rivera.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Good morning.
I only have 5 minutes, but I want to dig deeper into the whole the Medicaid situation.
Yes.
Right? First of all, there's a claim by the governor, and you talked about it a little bit, but I would love for you to expand, related to they're basically claiming that the localities are partly to blame for the increases because of enrollment and because of the role that the localities play. So do you agree with that, and what do you think about that?
Senator, I'm mystified by that claim. The budget director was trying to make this argument the other day, and I said that there's just no basis in fact for that. We are enrollment agents following state rules and state game plan. And unless, there was an allegation that somehow by saying to people, if you might be eligible, come talk to our enrollment people and see if you're eligible, that was somehow the wrong direction to be going in. That's exactly what the state of New York says in its own publications. That's what's been happening all over the state. Again, the growth in Medicaid enrollment has been primarily not in New York City. It's been in upstate and suburbs, and that's a good thing. So there's those funny situations, Senator, where people make a claim and they can't back it up and they don't provide any new evidence.
Which
actually
leads me to my next question. Actually, just right now, 30 minutes ago or so, there was a tweet by Danny Lever, I believe she works for the governor's communications team, in which he said, and I quote, "NYC is getting $300 million more in funding than this year than they did last. Not sure how the NYC mayor defines spending increases as cuts." Hold on, I'm going to definitely give you a chance to respond to that, but in relation to the fact that the governor's budget claims that the changes in the Medicaid share actually saved the state $150 million, but yet we've heard very clearly in your testimony that your calculations say that the impact to the city would be to the tune of just over $1 billion. So considering, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that you can actually provide me with how you got to those numbers,
yes.
Unlike, and I will say it for the record, last week we had where you are sitting right now, we had both the acting Medicaid director as well as the Department of Health, and neither of them could provide either privately or publicly how they reached some of these numbers. So what about that 300 more million and the supposed $150 million savings for the state that actually you claim with math that is going to be over $1 billion impact on the city? Could you give us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I'll start and our budget director can jump in. The fact is that the increase in Medicaid spending everywhere in the state aligns to more people getting Medicaid and the institution of the $15 minimum wage. And there's some other factors for sure. And there's some areas where all of us could find some savings and we want to. But what's strange here, it's getting a little Orwellian around here, right? I mean, this is an attempt to ask us to ignore obvious facts and believe in some parallel universe. No, the reason the costs went up are because of decisions made right here in Albany. By the way, they were good decisions. It was right to want more people to get health care. It was right to have a $15 minimum wage. It was right for the state to say if the state doesn't cover that growth, localities will go bankrupt, or they'll have to increase their property taxes or other things that would be devastating. So I don't understand why there isn't just an honest acknowledgement of what's really going on here, unless the executive branch wants to be known for taking Medicaid away from people, which is what Republican governors have been doing around the country, and they've made it a point to say, we don't want Medicaid expansion. There's a state that said we did want to make sure people got health care. And when you give people coverage, it avoids lots of much greater costs later on. We all know if people don't have coverage, they go to the emergency room. Mm-hmm. And they end up hospitalized and all sorts of things that could have been avoided.
And that costs us more money.
And that costs you more money.
So somebody's got to pay for that. So I'll just the last question as a yes or no question, and certainly you can add to it if you wish, besides the yes or the no. Considering that there might be some crisis and that there might be problems and issues that have to be resolved in Medicaid, et cetera, do you agree with me or not that it is obscene that this administration is choosing first to cut services for the most vulnerable across the state and to directly attack the system which provides health care for poor and working-class people across the state, that it is obscene and ridiculous that this administration chooses first to cut that as opposed to, I don't know, taxing the wealthy. Just, I don't know if you want to add anything.
In my
there.
own words, I would say, if the problem is revenue, then we should be taxing those who have done very, very well, who are still not paying their fair share. And by the way, that position is agreed upon all over this state, all over this country by Republicans, Independents, and Democrats alike. I think that's the solution. So I respect your word choice. You're a true truth teller in what you say and do, and I appreciate that. I'll say in my own words, if people want new revenue to solve this, I know where the money is.
Thank you. Assembly.
We go to Assemblywoman Nolan.
Here. I think
Microphone.
I
There you go.
the little button's on. I hope my voice will
There you
carry.
go.
Yeah. Very happy to see your team here. Congratulations to Shatad and as the interim director of state legislative affairs, and Simonia for having the baby that gave Shatad that opportunity. So happy to see your team here. Just would like you to talk a little bit more about your support for additional state funds for NYCHA. You know, in the past, and I would just suggest that obviously you cover so much ground in your testimony, but perhaps you have, I see some of your wonderful team here representing NYCHA every week in the Capitol, but I think it's important for members, particularly outside the city, to understand a little bit more about the scope of NYCHA and the history of state funding, because at one time we were giving several million, more than several, we were giving quite a bit of money to the state developments. Then that changed and we created a new category, and different federal funds came in differently, and I think people are not aware of how the federal funds have really almost been minimized in recent years. So I think that would be helpful. Even myself, I represent Queensbridge, Ravenswood, Astoria houses. They were always called federal developments. I know we were able to get the roof money, the $100 million, but I think it's important for members to have a better understanding of how we can help you get some state funds. And in line with that, there's a lot, you mentioned it in your State of the City last week, there's a lot of support for something new called community land trusts. And I guess I would like to have a better understanding, there's some support in my district for that, of how what would be the state role in that. Obviously, it doesn't have to be now, but as we go through this, I'd like to learn a little bit more about that. And, you know, we're happy to hear, happy the pre-K has been a success. We want to keep doing the things we need to do to fund our schools, but obviously there's always so many issues. So a little bit more on NYCHA, and I would like to ask also about the land trust.
I'm going to go in reverse order very quickly and ask our budget director in a second to fill in the blanks on the history, but to say thank you again for your leading role in getting us to pre-K. It has worked, and we're now continuing to develop 3K as well, and thank you. Never could have happened without all of you here. Second, on community land trusts, that's something that's based on city-owned land and developing it as affordable housing, permanent affordable housing, controlled by community members. We definitely could use state help and support in doing that for sure. On NYCHA, my simple way of explaining the history is about 40 years ago, around the time of the election of Ronald Reagan, is when support for public housing started to go from it being what's it going to take, which was really the way the federal government looked at it from the 1930s up to the 1970s, is that it was their thing. It was chartered because of the federal government, and that they had a foundational responsibility to fund it enough. From 1980 to present, that support has continued to decline. You've seen HUD budget proposals in recent years where the executive branch tried to zero out all sorts of support for public housing. Even when we came to a settlement with the federal government recently, it came with no new funding attached. So that's one part. The state, you're right, up to the 1990s, the state used to provide substantial ongoing support. Under Governor Pataki, that was removed.
It's about 25 million, 50 million?
That I'm going to see if Melanie knows that answer, but as I turn to her, I'll say, it went from a federally chartered, federally and state-supported system to one where, although there's still some federal support for sure, it consistently declined. Now we have to put in $6 billion of New York City taxpayer money to not even get us all the way to where we need to go, but to only keep some of the pieces moving forward.
And I just want to, it's still about 1 million families. And the average income of those families is?
400,000 people.
People, right.
And because the other piece is the Section 8 program, which
Right,
is,
right.
so you're talking about in NYCHA, it's
Half a
400,000.
million in NYCHA, half a million on Section 8. I don't know what the average income is for the NYCHA family, the average NYCHA family, but those are the things I think sometimes our colleagues from other parts of the state would be useful to share that so that people get a sense of not only the scope, but also the need and how at a time when the city has become filled with so many high-rise luxury housing, NYCHA is providing housing for working families. I think sometimes that gets lost, but let me let you. Thank you.
I had just asked my staff to come back with an answer on that, as
You
well
have
as
to
on the
pull a water
federal.
for me.
I just asked my staff to come back with an answer on the federal disinvestment over the course of our actual investments, as I may refer to the $6 billion, and the income question.
Thank you. And you're right, working families.
We'll follow up. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to the chairs. I like to say Madam Chair because it's still historic that Helene and Liz are sitting there, so thank you.
Thank you, Senate.
Thank you. Senate Finance Ranker Jim Seward.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to return to a discussion once again on the Medicaid question. You've stated here this morning that this would cost the city $1.1 billion. And of course, according to other state officials, that it's more like a couple of $100 million, if anything at all, depending on whether or not property taxes go up over 2% and so on. You know, we as legislators, we need correct information. We have constituents and taxpayers to answer to, and we need to make decisions, you know, based on facts. So how did you come up with such a wildly different conclusion than, shall we say, the Division of the Budget and other state officials?
I'm going to let the budget director explain the specific calculations. I would only say to you, Senator, that I think from the beginning of the discussion the last few weeks, there has not been a consistent message from the executive branch. And the very fact that the claim is being made that localities in your district and where I represent are somehow responsible for an increase, when that goes against everything we know about how Medicaid is run, I think that calls into question all the calculations, because the foundation of the discussion is not consistent.
You know, I went on the city's website, in the official website, and it states explicitly that there are 1,800 Medicaid program staff that will, quote, determine your eligibility for long-term care Medicaid coverage, evaluate your medical needs, determine the appropriate care, and develop a service plan if you are medically eligible. Would you agree that you know, because the city of New York is not responsible currently for any growth in the Medicaid program, that there's really no incentive for the city to care about cost overruns as eligibility is determined and appropriate level of care is determined by your staff?
No, I would not agree, Senator, respectfully, and again, I'll turn to the budget director on how we got to our number, but just to answer your very important question. Senator, I would say to you that, again, the standards you saw there on that website are exactly the same ones the state of New York holds. Again, the expansion has not been in the city in recent years. It's been upstate and suburbs by the policies of the state of New York. Now, the state of New York said, we don't want people who are eligible to get Medicaid, so we're instructing localities, do not sign up eligible people for Medicaid. Well, that would be a different instruction. But we're following the state's very own concept that people who are eligible should get health care. So I just, no, and by the way, we've offered cost savings consistently and haven't been able to get the state to act on them. That's that $260 million we talked about. It is documented that we could be working on that right now with the state. So, no, Senator, I gotta tell you, it's the fiction that somehow, oh, we're being spendthrift because we don't write the check. No, we're following rules. If all of you say you want different rules for how Medicaid's handled in New York State, we will follow those rules. But we're following the rules of the game as determined in Albany.
In the time that I have remaining, I want to shift the discussion to crime in the city, which does.
Can I just get the budget director to answer your question on how we got to the number?
Very briefly.
Sure. As we and every other county understands it, if you as a local county exceed a 2% property cap, tax, which we do not have in New York City, and your Medicaid growth is over 3% year over year, you're responsible for 100% of the Medicaid growth if you exceed both of those caps, those artificial caps. When we looked at our Medicaid growth, which was 7% over the course of the last state fiscal year, as reported by the state, that translates into $1.1 billion. In my conversations, or in my staff's conversations with other counties, they too are understanding the same scenario. There may be other counties who are actually living within their 2% cap, but the minute they go over the 3% Medicaid cap, they are responsible for that cost, and they are in a predicament as well. And I would just also add, for those who continue to talk about a 2% property tax, there's probably no county that would say that that is actually a good thing for them because of their rising costs, right? Being able to afford to pay for education, as New York City can, and other basic city services, when you have a 2% cap in place, makes it extremely difficult, then exacerbated by the 3% Medicaid cap.
I wanted to, thank you. I wanted to ask one quick question on the crime in the city. We're already up about 17% already in about a month into this year over last year. And to what do you attribute this dramatic increase in crime in the city? I'm talking about robberies, burglaries, shootings, and what steps is the city going to take to control this?
Thank you, Senator. I want to emphasize two things: that the NYPD, using CompStat as our basic strategic approach, as we have for 25 years, is making immediate adjustments to the things we're seeing. For example, we're seeing a lot of instances of young people robbing other young people. There are specific strategies that can be used to address that and reduce that. We had, thank God, in the month of January, a reduction in murders, a reduction in rapes, so it's not just one direction, but where we are seeing real problems is particularly in areas such as robbery. NYPD strategically will move officers to where the greatest problems are manifesting, change strategies to address that. That's what we do. The underlying issue, and I say again, I believe the bail reform bill was the right thing to do. I do believe there's a connection clearly between a change in law and this kind of unusual uptick. Our police commissioner has stated clearly his reasoning, and I have tremendous respect for his analysis. I think there's always more than one factor in anything in life, and there could be statistical variations, but it's the only major thing that changed. That said, I think we can all work together to address the outstanding issues in this legislative session in a productive way.
You have some changes in the bail.
As you know, and I've said it this year and last, I think judicial discretion would be the thing that would not undermine the very appropriate goals of the reform, but would allow us all to move forward effectively. I really believe that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly.
We go to Assemblyman Rah.
Good afternoon, Mayor. I'm going to continue on that same topic. Does the data that you've seen as far as January, indicate that there's a correlation there in terms of, people that may have been released committing additional crimes?
Assembly member, I'm glad you asked it that way because I don't think it's just that, and I want to be real clear. I think the biggest thing that changed between this January and last January, that's how we do our statistics, is comparing month to month. The biggest thing that changed was a change in law, unquestionably. Again, can there be statistical variations for other reasons? Of course. But I don't think it's simply the issue of was an individual out on bail. I think there's more to it than that. And the question in my mind is how we look at an ever-changing criminal justice system and figure out how to make it more effective, how to make it respond to crime more quickly and show that there are clear consequences. So I think we have some bigger work to do together. I personally believe the single most powerful step would be to put the right kind of judicial discretion in place. But I want to be really clear, and to the previous question as well. While we're all having this very respectful conversation, and we are, I mean, I've spoken to all the key leadership in this city on how we work together. The NYPD is going to make adjustments right now. We have done it time and again. There's a reason you've seen 25 years of straight decline in crime. We're going to make the adjustments now to address the situation in the meantime.
Okay. Thank you. And on the same topic, there's obviously needs that have come up with regard to the reforms in terms of new resources and new approaches, I would say. And one of them, obviously, that has gotten coverage lately is the idea of those less restrictive alternatives like ankle monitors. So where is the city in terms of getting that program up and running? I know some members of the judiciary have expressed some frustration that they haven't had that option in certain cases that they felt it may have been appropriate.
I'm going to start very quickly and turn to our budget director, who I know has got more of the detail on the things we've been doing to respond to the new law. Look, we have a very aggressive supervised release approach. I will note respectfully, it's unfunded, so we've had to come up with those resources ourselves. Other localities are trying their best, and a lot of them are struggling to address the unfunded elements of the different criminal justice reform bills. I can say for sure we have some aggressive supervised release strategies that we think are going to be effective in this environment, but it has been a struggle to do it on this kind of timeline and with this kind of cost. Would you like to speak to any specifics?
Sure, just to say that we've invested over $103 million in supervised release. And as the mayor pointed out, the $70 million for annual cost on discovery. And as it relates to the ankle monitors that you're referring to, we actually are in the process of launching a pilot program.
Okay, now, can you just repeat that? What is the cost that the city's looking at in terms, I fully agree this is a mandate that we have thrust upon our counties without funding. What is the cost that the city believes that I know there's so many different aspects of it. There's discovery, there's other type of monitor release. In terms of the ankle monitoring program, I know in the past it was administered in a different way at times was used in different ways, but in terms of the new requirements of the reforms?
We'll get you an answer right now.
Okay. Thank you. If I can shift quickly to one other topic, housing. There are, after the changes of the rent laws that were adopted last year, there have been some reports in rent-regulating buildings having some decrease in their value. How is that reflected in tax assessments? Is there a concern that reductions in assessments on those properties could create a budgetary shortfall within the city?
Well, what I'd say, Assemblymember, is, again, I think the actions taken in the law were very, very important to protecting affordability, and I commend the legislature for its actions. We are monitoring to see if there's any unintended consequences. We're obviously paying close attention to that. I think it's too early for us to say definitively at this point. What I want to make sure we all do together is protect affordability and also make sure that buildings are maintained well and that there's every incentive for landlords to ensure there's a supply of affordable quality housing. So far, we're seeing very good results from the law in terms of affordability, but it's too early to tell on the bigger trends.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senate.
Thank you. Senator Felder.
Good morning, and I want to echo the thanks that many of my colleagues have given to the wonderful programs like pre-K and other things that your administration has innovated. But for 14 years, New York City has been out of compliance with the Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And unfortunately, nothing matches the consistent level of negligence by your administration. As a result of loads of work and pressure by the Senate and Assembly, on June 24th, 2014, you held a press conference and announced an action plan to help the families of students with disabilities. You said that the administrative changes committed to included expediting settlement decisions, not relitigating cases that were already settled, reducing paperwork, expediting payments. And for a period of time, things actually improved somewhat. But unfortunately, that was followed by years of decline. I have a timeline. September 1st, 2015, I wrote you detailing the difficulties that families with special needs children were having with special ed system. December 10th, 2015, I wrote you about the same thing. May 4th, 2016, you testified here again before the Senate recommitted to the reforms that you had promised earlier. 2016, September 6, 2016, December 6, 2016, I requested a meeting, I didn't get a response. January 30th, 2017, you testified again, and I question you again about the lack of implementation of the reforms that you had promised. February 22nd, 2017, I finally met with some of your staff members on this issue. October 8th, 2018, the Times, New York Times runs an article about the difficulties that families with special needs children face getting services and highlighted the case of TJ, a 12-year-old who the special education system had totally failed. August 2019, I wrote you again about this problem and this crisis. I got no response. Just yesterday, USA Today ran a story about two boys, Isaac and Landon, both with dyslexia, whose families struggled to get help in New York's special education system. Every year, the mayor comes to Albany and literally, days before announces some positive development or promise. But we've gotten used to broken promises. And unfortunately, the mayor has a very reliable pattern of broken promises in this area over and over again. You know the expression, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. According to the data that exists now, there are over 10,000 students like these. And I want to thank Senator Jackson for bringing up this issue. 10,000 students that are simply waiting to have their cases heard. Then, if parents actually win their case, it takes months and sometimes years for children to receive services
Senator
and payment
Felder, do me
for
a favor.
those cases.
Senator Felder, just put the poster down. We don't allow that.
I'm sorry?
We don't allow posters in the budget hearing, so just put that down and continue your questions.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
We are in crisis. Incompetence of this magnitude is not believable. Corruption is more likely what is happening. I'm asking you, Mr. Mayor, to join me in requesting that an independent monitor from the DOI do a thorough investigation as to why over 10,000 special needs students are in crisis. How did this happen? And what has to be done to fix the problem? I'm asking you to do this immediately, and I will be sending a letter as soon as this hearing is over with this request.
Assembly.
Well, you know what? It's
Yeah.
very easy because I am next on the Assembly side, and I didn't know if you wanted to say something to Senator Felder, but he and I are, and as well as others in both houses, do share concern about the backlog of payments to the parents of children who have alternative placements. So I know we've been having some discussions with the administration, and we are hopeful that there would be something forthcoming soon that could give some reassurance to the parents, to these families of when they can see more timely payments of placements that they are being forced to put out. I'm not sure you need to respond to that.
I'll only respond,
if you
thank
want
you,
to.
Madam Chair. I'll only respond, I do think our budget director should tell you the amount of money that is being spent to address this very problem, because it stands to reason when you see this kind of a shift in a budget towards special ed families, that we are trying actually all the time to get them the resources they need. So I'm not going to go into any detail in response to the previous. There is no corruption. This is about a system that was broken for the longest time, that we're trying to fix constantly, that we're spending hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to get people what they deserve. We definitely have more work to do. I'm not going to say anything different than we have a lot to keep fixing. But it is not for a second that people are not trying all day to get this done. Go ahead, Melanie.
Sure. So when we started, we were about $5.2 billion in spending on special education. And by the time we ended our fiscal year 19, we were at $6.9 billion. And we are forecast to go up to $7.2 billion in the current year, and then $7.3 billion in fiscal year 21. This includes, this past spring, we invested $33.4 million to bring additional services, including for children on the autistic spectrum. That was where we were seeing a very big need within the school system to ramp up for that population. We are also working very aggressively to get the 4410 schools for special education needs children, pre-K, to get them additional funding through the state and increase their rates, as well as what we can do as a city to contract with them directly around services to provide better quality there and meet the need. And then on the Carter cases, my staff has personally been meeting with DOE over the course of several months now, upwards, I would say even more towards a year, to look at the particular backlog. We've invested in attorneys to deal and address with the backlog, and we are on track to have processed all the 18-19 prior year settlements as we committed to. And for 19 and 20 claims, we're over 90% successful in meeting reviews for the 10-day filings, but that's acknowledging that there's more to do. We have invested more money, including as recently as this past plan. We're at $540 million annually for Carter cases. But again, I acknowledge that there's much more that we can do, and I'm happy to meet with you, with my staff, to talk about what more we need to do.
And Madam Chair, just to make sure that is clear in human terms, I mean, when you're spending $2 billion more a year, I don't know what says more clearly that we want parents and kids to get what they need. We're creating the programs in our schools to make sure that kids can get them more effectively. And this point about kids on the autism spectrum, that's an area where the public schools have proven that they can serve kids well, and we're building out those programs in our schools. So there's no looking for something outside, there's no reimbursement, just show up and you get what you need. So this is something we are constantly trying to improve upon, and we want to work with you to find every next step we can take, and we need your help on the special ed pre-K issue to get the state to increase those rates so we can serve more kids. But there's constant focus and constant resources being put into solving this problem.
Thank you on that, and I wanted to bring an issue of bed that's in the governor's budget regarding the STAR program to your attention. I'm not sure if you've looked at it. There's a proposal to eliminate STAR benefits to someone who is behind in their property taxes, who's in default of their property taxes. There is concern that has been expressed to me that property tax foreclosures are a challenge, especially for seniors, and especially for seniors who are confronted with a reverse mortgage foreclosure, where the loss of that exemption just it makes resolving those kinds of cases more difficult. So I'm not sure if you folks have looked at it yet. If not, so I'd like to know your opinion about that provision, and if you haven't looked at it, if you could, and get back to us with a position.
I will look into it and get back to you. Clearly, any benefit that's taken away, though, from seniors especially is of great concern. I'll just say that right off the top.
Thank you, and if you could share what the potential impact would be for New York City seniors in that situation.
Thank you for raising it. That's
We were joined by Assemblywoman Wright, and Assemblyman Epstein, and we now go to the Senate for a question.
Senator Diane Savino.
Senator Krueger. Good morning, good afternoon.
Good
Wow,
afternoon.
it's already 1 o'clock. So I'm not going to repeat the questions about Medicaid. I think you've fairly well answered them. I will say that I agree with you on my concerns about the state continuing to not fund close to home and raise the age. As a New York City representative, I get a little offended when people say they're New York City's children. In fact, they are New York City's and New York State's children, and we should take care of them. On the property tax issue, I'm one of those people that stands to benefit if we do this correctly, as all of my constituents are, and I appreciate the fact that you recognize that the system is not only unfair, but that you're even willing to pay more in taxes, because I look forward to that. One day, we should be on the opposite side.
I'll give you a check.
I want to raise an issue, though, that's in your testimony, two things, and since we don't have a lot of time, I'll just say them both. On the cannabis side, I'm happy that you support it. I would say let us be a little more thoughtful about the idea of a New York City license as well. We don't do that with medical, and it's complicated enough to cite dispensaries under the current restrictions that the federal government places on states that provide or allow for medical marijuana and/or adult use. It's hard enough to, as I like to joke, you can't swing a dead cat in Brooklyn without hitting a school, a daycare center, a church, any of the places that you couldn't put a legal dispensary anyway. So I would just say proceed cautiously on that. And finally, in your testimony, you talk about the concerns that we have about small businesses and mom and pops. I represent an area where we have some suffering commercial strips, Port Richmond Avenue, the area around Tappan Park, Coney Island, and one of the things that the property owners there say to me is they're not holding back the spaces because they don't want to rent them. They can't find tenants that can commit to multi-year leases. And on top of that, the tenants who are there, the small businesses, say that one of the things that drives them out, besides, all sorts of fines and penalties that the city places on them, whether it's the size of their awnings or new restrictions on them, it's that commercial property tax is factored into the rent of the tenants, and it's growing at a rapid rate, and they can't afford to renew their leases. And so what happens is you have landlords who have vacant storefronts, and no one wants to see them replace those vacant storefronts with chain stores and pharmacies and banks, but that becomes the only people that can move in, build out the space, and commit to a multi-year lease. So it's almost as if we're going around in circles. So I'm just concerned about your proposal that landlords would pay an additional tax if they keep their spaces empty, when in fact they don't want to keep them empty. They're trying to find ways to encourage small businesses to come in, but the local costs are becoming exorbitant on small businesses, and we're defeating the purpose.
Senator, I really appreciate you raising that, because no one's saying it's like one easy formula here. So one of the things I said in the State of the City is, we've reduced small business fines by 40%. We're going to reduce them 10% more. We are going to provide low-interest loans, legal assistance, much more facilitation for small businesses to open or to deal with whatever problems they're dealing with. There's no question the city can do a lot of things to help. But I do want to argue the point that I don't understand how a landlord can say, oh, I can't find a tenant to take up a commercial space when it's a question of supply and demand. I've talked to lots of people who own small businesses and want to own small businesses who are confronted with exorbitant rent levels. We know, certainly in my neighborhood, that small businesses that wanted to stay where they were thrown out by landlords who wanted to jack up the rent.
But part of the rent is the property tax that's passed through on commercial tenants. So I would just say that while people might want to be in 7th Avenue and Park Slope because it's desirable, there are other parts of the city where it's less desirable. You don't have a lot of street traffic. And we cannot deny that consumer habits have changed permanently. Less and less people like to walk the avenue with their shopping cart. They're just not doing it. They sit home, they order their food, they order their dinner, they order their furniture, they order their shoes, they order everything online, and it's delivered right to their door. So I would just say, instead of looking for a culprit, perhaps we should have a more holistic approach. What can we do to support small businesses, and what can we do to support property owners who would like to have businesses on their property?
So just finishing, I agree with your the point about need for a holistic approach, unquestionably. I agree with you that there's big changes in consumer behavior underlying this, unquestionably. So from the city perspective, reduce fines, provide a lot more direct support facilitation for small business. Also, what I mentioned, taking $500 million in pension funds and investing those in small businesses so they can have more chance of being productive. All of those things would help. I would only disagree on one point, that I think some part of this, agreeing with you there's many, many factors, some part of this in some neighborhoods has been a store that was there for a long time, and a landlord saying, no, we're doubling the rent. I mean, Near's Tavern, I'm sure you saw the coverage of that in Woodhaven, Queens. That was an instance where the landlord was talking about raising the monthly rent by thousands. Those are individual choices which I think are unfair to communities. And I think it's fair to say that landlords have responsibility here to a community, particularly with historic businesses that mean so much to communities. And if they're going to try, which we've seen some do, to jack up the rent so much that the existing tenant has to leave, the existing store has to leave, the jobs, everything go with them, and then it sits there. I think there's got to be some disincentive. There's got to be something that says, if you've got a business in there, work with that business to keep them there. So hearing all your other points, I still think that's a part of the problem we're trying to address.
Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly.
We've been joined by Assemblywoman Richardson, and we go to Assemblywoman Wright for a question.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. I do want to reiterate, I want to follow up and further support what Senator Savino was speaking about. I'm getting lots of complaints from these proposals to penalize the building owners for vacancies, for spaces that are vacant. The small businesses along the corridors stand in solidarity with those owners and very often, because the supports that they're looking for are not for people to be penalized, but actually to undergird the business and the community. They are faced with tremendous fines, and even the new sanitation system that the city has instituted does not support the small micro mom and pop businesses. What it's done is it's created regions where there's no competition. They're still suffering under a lot of fines from inspections and what they feel is somewhat arbitrary enforcement against them. So I think the community, the small mom and pop business communities are looking for something that's more holistic, that doesn't create demons in the system. They all work together, and that part of our conversation has to relate back to how we tax those commercial spaces. It is a part of the leases and most standard commercial leases. So until we address that, the problem is going to happen. We're not trying to say that there's not going to be one or two bad actors who double rents unnecessarily. However, I don't know what's going on in those relationships, but those are the outliers. That's not the standard. And a lot of the vacant spaces are not vacant because someone tried to double rent. So I think that we need to really address how we're supporting small micro corridors. I know that it took over 10 years before one of my small corridors was included in the NYC, I think it's the NYC Go advertising campaign that's supposed to support small businesses. It shouldn't take a decade. Regarding our tax system, I have gone through the proposal. The thing that you have not addressed is the fact that we assess values based upon recent transactions. In a community such as Bedford-Stuyvesant or Crown Heights, that means that they're going to see their tax values go up under your plan. That is not something we want to see because it's based on, historically, for this past about decade, the city allowing that to be the community where outside investors were able to wash their money through our community and artificially inflate home prices. There's no place where home values has gone up 3 or 4 times or nearly as quickly as it has in a Bed-Stuy and a Crown Heights over this 10-year period. We allowed outside investors, those homes flip at least twice before someone purchases it that actually wants to live in a community. These are cash deals, and it's a problem. And then so long as we are going to base the taxing system on artificially inflated assessments, we're going to have a problem, particularly in a working class community like a Bedford-Stuyvesant and a Crown Heights. And I also want to reiterate that I would like to get the information related to the tax liens, because that is a big problem in our community. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll get you the follow-up information for sure. Everything you said I'm taking in, and I think stands to reason we have to address all of it, and I agree with you when you say on the holistic point on small business, no one is here saying there's one magic formula. It's going to take a lot of different pieces to overcome what's become a crisis that, I mean, 6 years ago when I took office, totally different environment for retail. It has been shocking how much has changed, so we're going to have to use a lot of different tools. And I hear loud and clear your concern on that tax issue there, and we will certainly look at that for sure. On the question of the property tax reform, only to say to you that, one, we're trying to balance, we're obviously trying to come up with something that will address the reality of the whole city. We are trying to acknowledge that for people who have owned a home for a long time, many of whom seniors, for example, that there's ways to make sure that that burden does not hit them in the way we've structured this proposal. This is only a preliminary proposal, obviously. There's going to be a fuller proposal. So I think we can lessen whatever negative impact. I think for those who are speculating that you point to, you know, they are going to end up dealing with paying a higher rate.
No, what we're seeing is that the proposal says that those who have homes near those buildings that have been traded in speculation or speculating trades are now going to be penalized because home assessments will be based upon sale values. And sale values are artificially inflated in this community because it has been a target for home flipping over the past decade, largely cash deals. So I just need your proposal to address that fact. That's
No,
all.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Seti?
Thank you. I'm not going to take your time today, Mr. Mayor, because I do spend quite a bit of time chatting with your staff, and we've taken up so much time today for one mayor with a long list of other people waiting. But I do want to give our Senate chair of the Cities Committee one more shot to ask you 5 minutes worth of questions. It's only 5 minutes on the second round. Thank you. Senator Jackson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hello. Hello, Mayor.
Yep.
So, thank you for spending the time here this morning answering questions in order to help us deal with this state budget that we're dealing with. And obviously, it's a crisis, in my opinion, unless we do the right thing in order to make sure that all New Yorkers, no matter where you live, are taken care of. But I just need to ask a question. I was reading some questions on the other big four mayors and cities that are coming up. And one question, it says that Buffalo is currently slated to receive about $161 million in AIM funding. And I remember that New York City, who used to receive AIM funding of over $300 million. Are we still receiving AIM money like every other municipality in the state of New York?
No, sir. It's been many years. Fiscal 2011 was when we last received AIM money, none since then.
I think I remember going back when there was a commitment by the governor at that time that don't worry about it, we'll make sure that you get it the next year. And then when Governor Cuomo came in, he said, I didn't make that promise. So New York City has been cut out of at least $300 million. I mean, if it was $300 million back in 2011, it must be about $750 million right now that we would normally get as a result of aid to municipalities. I mean, New York City is the engine of New York State. You would agree with that?
Absolutely, in terms of creating jobs, creating revenue for the whole state. There's no question. And we're proud to be a part of the state and contribute to the state. But your point is well taken, that when you take away $300 million, it's now grown in value. You're right, and it never came back, despite promises. And then, as I mentioned, just since I have been mayor, an additional $1 billion in annual impact in terms of cuts to our budget, from the state, and then a whole host of unfunded mandates that we have had to pay for. This is really undercutting our ability to serve people. These cuts this time proposed by the executive equal more than all the cuts we've received over the previous 6 years combined. That's the magnitude we're talking about here. And the fact that I'm sad, Senator, that I had to tell you how many clinics would be closed, how many doctors and nurses would be laid off, how many after-school programs would be canceled, how many summer youth programs would be canceled. That's the magnitude of what we're talking about here.
Well, let me just say that I represent Marble Hill, Inwood, Washington Heights, and Upper West Side, and Midtown, and I go down to Chelsea and the projects, and I tell you there's a lot of need out there based on me going around, and especially I was in Chelsea houses and I communicated with NYCHA. There are rat holes all over the place, and people are really complaining about the rats. And I know this is Lunar New Year, the year of the rat, but the little rat that I have is a little toy rat for my grandson to play with. But let me just ask the question. I heard people talk about the laws that we passed last year. I want you, Mr. Mayor, I know that you said you feel that some tweakings need to happen with the law. On February 3rd, the Daily News opinion section, A Tale of Mental Health, Not Bail, by Luis Sepulveda, our state senator, and Cheryl Roberts. If you haven't read that, I ask you to please read that. Yes, and then also, on January 28th, Ron Kuby wrote an article in the Daily News, No Backing Down on Bail Now. And then the New York Times Sunday edition on January 26th, this law could end mass incarceration. And I say this is the article in the New York Times, and it cites North Carolina and Texas enacted laws in the last decade requiring broad disclosure of evidence known as discovery. At first, prosecutors said the requirement was unworkable and put witnesses and victims at risk by potentially disclosing their identities. But judges in those states and in New York can limit disclosure when necessary. Basically, it's working in a lot of other places. And so I think that we need to give it a chance. And even someone in an article, one of them said, let's not talk about weeks. Let's consider over a period of months and see if it's working and needs to be tweeted. So I just say that to you, if you have not read those articles. And the person that gave me this article, the New York Times, who's up on it just as much as I am, is my wife. So I ask you to please, and everyone else who's asking questions, please consider what we're talking about. We passed laws based on the situation last year. We said, give it a chance to work, and that's what I'm asking.
Senator, it's a good law. I thank you for passing the law, and I think in many ways it is contributing to exactly what you hope for, a more just system and a huge reduction in mass incarceration. We're seeing that already. That is working. I'm simply saying to you, I think there's something that has to be done to balance, and it can be done without undercutting the goals of the law. And it's something I've felt for a long time, way before this law was passed, in terms of judicial discretion. But I do want to say on mental health, those who are saying we've got a lot more to do on mental health are 100% right. I don't think it's an either-or. We did a very powerful new report, our police department, our health department, a few months back, that showed all the ways there's still a huge disconnect between judges, prosecutors, police, health agencies, and social services that should all be working on a single case together to get people the mental health services they need. We are way off the mark on that. All of us are going to have to work together, city and state, to get that done. But in the meantime, I think we can work together on this law to protect its very, very positive impact, but improve upon it.
Thank you for your leadership and your staff's leadership.
Thank you very much, Senator.
We go to Assembly.
Madam Chair, I'm sorry. Could I just give a quick response to the previous question from Assemblymember Nolan? We owed her an answer.
Sure.
So, Assemblymember Nolan, just to say to you, the average household income in public housing is about $25,000 for a family. And to say to you that we have seen reductions in federal, in fact, you do this because I can't read your handwriting. Go ahead, Melanie.
Sure. Over the course.
for getting it for us.
Yeah.
Over the course of 2001 to 2018, on the expense side for NYCHA, operating loss of $1.4 billion, and in terms of capital federal funding loss over that same time period, it's $1.3 billion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We go to Assemblyman Weapern for one question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for coming as you do. As you know, I chair the Corrections Committee in the Assembly, and more than half of incarcerated individuals in upstate facilities are originally from New York City. And we have a problem with reentry and those individuals that are being discharged from state facilities, many of them way upstate, many of whom have lost ties with their families and their previous communities, and we have a major problem with housing. I worked last year, we started to, with Steve Banks, on trying to get a discharge plan to help everybody where formerly incarcerated individuals could be placed rather than just go into homeless facilities and where it really wasn't working, they weren't getting the services that they needed, they weren't getting the employment opportunities, et cetera. So we started to work on a plan, but I guess the session kind of ran out and we weren't able to achieve anything legislatively. So what I'd like to say to you is I'd like to see a commitment, and I know Steve Banks indicated that it was something that the administration wanted to do, but maybe if you could give me an update on what plan is happening, what's being done to house those individuals who need housing upon being released, and it being able to provide services. Obviously, that would reduce any recidivism if they have housing and if they have employment opportunities. That would make a huge difference once they're discharged.
Assemblymember, first of all, thank you. You've really played a crucial role in helping us to make our correction system safer, and I want to thank you on behalf of the people in New York City for that. Our budget director will speak to the specific follow-up we're trying to do on the issue you raised.
Sure. So we have an annual investment of $34 million in next fiscal year to support discharge planning in the Department of Corrections. And then two numbers that I'm waiting on for my staff to get me now for you are part of the agreement we reached with the City Council on the borough-based jails, where we made an investment in transitional housing, exactly for that reason that you just mentioned. We don't want people winding up in shelter, but how can we transition them from prison, reentry into communities and into their homes again? And we also made an investment there in discharge planning. I'll have those numbers for you.
Yeah, but I'm talking about those individuals being released from state facilities, not local jails.
Correct, but the idea being that it's just for both when you think about both populations. So it's a $25 million additional investment in transitional housing.
Okay, well, I'd love to work with you on it, and I know Steve Banks had an interest in it, so if we could continue the dialogue and, continue that discussion.
Yeah, we need your help on that. Appreciate it.
No
And
problem.
just to add, Assemblymember, so we continue to support the legislation that you're talking about and making those commitments. And while the resources that Melanie had mentioned are for individuals leaving city custody, we are actively open to allowing individuals leaving state custody into our programs. And we've also launched the Jails to Jobs initiative in order to connect those individuals to job opportunities upon leaving custody as well. So that's not limited. That is open and available to all.
Good, thank you. Hope to work with you on it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
So, Mr. Mayor, I have the last set of questions. I know you touched on homelessness, and to follow up also now Assemblyman Weprin talking about the corrections and homelessness. I was wondering if you can just give us where we are with the 90 shelter plan, how many have opened so far. I understand one of the first is Central Brooklyn. What communities are the ones that are open? And just in terms of the youth that need more support services, what kind of services are happening? Community schools, mental health services for the homeless
Just clarifying,
population.
Madam Chair, when you're saying youth, you mean, you're not talking about homeless youth, you're talking about in general or homeless youth in specific?
No, homeless youth.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'll start and turn to Melanie. In terms of homeless youth, a very big focus both in shelter and in the schools, because obviously we know which schools have a substantial number of kids who are homeless. I mean, it's a horrible sentence to even have to say that we have schools that have a lot of kids that are homeless, but it's true. So we've added more social workers, guidance counselors, attendants, teachers, you name it. More tutoring. There's a whole host of things being directed to those kids specifically, and we do think it's having an impact. We are also trying to reduce consistently, as part of that very same plan you mentioned with the new shelter creation, try and reduce the phenomenon of a kid ending up with their family in a shelter far away from their original neighborhood. We're trying to reorient the entire shelter system. God forbid anyone ends up in shelter. We want it to be in their same borough and ideally in their same neighborhood so the child can go easily to the same school. For the first time in recent years, we've been providing bus service to make sure kids, if they're not right there in their own school zone, can get to their home school. So we're doing all that. On the shelters, we have 31 that have been opened. 64 have been initiated, meaning the specific sites announced, and they're moving forward. We do believe we'll be able to get to our overall goal on the timeline we enunciated. And the goal there is to ensure that we get out of those pay-by-the-day hotels, get out of those substandard clusters, and then when we have all the new shelters up and running, they are convertible to affordable housing at the point where we continue to compress our shelter system. So it's our goal to keep reducing the number in shelters so we can get to that day.
So just to follow up on, in terms of the young people who, the children who are attending public schools, if they're not able to go to their home school because of the distance and that, are the funds following them to their new school? Because I know that there's been some issues. I know in my own community there have been issues of shelter opening and a school being overwhelmed by the students and not having the resources to be able to provide the services they need.
Yes, so as part of the Bridging the Gap program, where we have put social workers in place in schools, they are getting specialized training and they should be following the students. And then we made another investment with the City Council to also expand greatly the number of social workers. And so that should be happening. As part of the transportation issue as well, if we weren't able to place within the neighborhood, we then also did a restructuring of the transportation if it was just too long of a trip, meaning it was more than 2 hours. So we've done a lot of work on that as well. But if there are specific issues, we should, happy to follow up with you and address them directly. My team with Department of Education.
Thank you. So I think we promised a shorter time than last year. We're about 15 minutes shorter this time.
God bless you, Madam Chair.
We were trying for more, but we are trying to run a tight ship. I know there's some follow-ups for some of the members, if you could provide that, and then in terms of, if we could have the list of where the homeless shelters that have already opened or in stages of being opened
We can get that to you right away.
located. All the follow-up information will be shared with the
With everyone.
with all of the members. Thank you for being here, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you both, and thank you to all members. Thank you.
Thank you.
Byron Brown, Mayor of Buffalo.
So as people leave, just want to give a heads up that we